So welcome back to the closing discussions of digital autonomy and smart wearables here at Einstein Center Digital Future. We're doing two different things actually for this closing discussion. We're moving some of the questions of the last talk we've just heard into this one, and then take it from there. I'm trying to wrap up and touch on pretty much all the subjects, I hope, that we've covered this afternoon. I think digital literacy, of course, what you just mentioned at the end, Michelle, is actually, when I understand it correctly, at the core of what IniviDas is trying to do. So I think we'll have a good starting point for this discussion. If you haven't been with us all those 3.5 hours by now, just a real quick introduction again of the panel. Right to my side is Becky Caldwell from Garmin, one of the big producers of wearables, of course, being part of IniviDas project also. We have Michelle Christensen, who you just heard of, the Critical Makers Lab. We have Saskia Nagel from Aachen, who told us about applied ethics today. And we have Gesche Joost, new here in this panel discussion. She's a board member here at Einstein Center Digital Future, so she's pretty much our host this afternoon, actually. She's also, of course, professor of design research at UDK, Berlin University of the Arts, and Weizenbaum Institute. Maybe it would be interesting to mention, since we talk about education, here in a bit she's also a founding member of Calliope, which is digital education to children starting from 3rd grade with mini computers made by Calliope. So welcome to this round, Gesche, Joost, and all the panelists for our closing discussions. Thank you for bearing with us. So just as a, to pick up the thread, Gesche, Joost, to what we've just heard here, program or be programmed, right? I think it was by Willem Flusser that you quoted with this. And of course, this is, by digital terms, a very old dream of digitization, going back to the 80s and the 90s. The Chaos Computer Club in Germany would have said that too. Everybody has to learn how to program. Now, that certainly didn't work in the 80s and the 90s, because the interfaces provided for such a smooth experience for everybody, so not everybody learned to program, right? Is this like a second attempt now to actually start a similar movement that we have already seen in the past, or is there like a categorical difference to what Flusser meant in the 80s? What would you say?
I think in a way it's a second wave. So I think so. I also personally went through different waves. So in the 90s, I was totally optimistic about the internet as an emerging, not just technology, but a new kind of societal structure that should be more equal and more democratic. And I was, really enthusiastic about open source. Everything is accessible for everybody on the whole planet. And I thought really, everybody could take part in the digital society. This is not really the case, so to say it, at least. And so we went through the through the valley, let's say, of of hate speech, of emerging digital inequalities, of all the kind of negative sides of data monopolies, and so on. So we had kind of the dark age of the internet, and I think that we are now kind of recovering a bit, also on the European level with the regulation that's put into place in the last years. And we try to balance and have a new approach. And I still think that we should all learn programming, so at least understand it a bit, just know in a bit what an algorithm is and what it could do and what it could not do, also to be more also capable of doing, decisions and being online in an appropriate way. Maybe not, providing all the data about myself, but I think it's now more a better way of this kind of second wave of, optimizing and not self-optimizing, but coming to a more inclusive vision of the digital society, because this should be the goal, and it's a very social goal. It's not a technological dream.
If I understand you correctly, this would have to start in grade school, right? This would something that would have to be regulated by the state, actually, while what the Chaos Computer Club or Willem Flusser meant probably in the 80s was a counterculture at the time, right? It was something done underground and not like in state apparatuses, as schools certainly are. So that might be one kind of drastic change, I would say. You would disagree, Michelle?
We need all levels. I think the bottom-up development is absolutely not to be underestimated. I think something that changed, like Gesche said, because it's a new wave, is it was very political in the beginning, what the CCC did, but they were also very driven by the fascination with technology. So learning these computers, hacking, right, being able to, you know, outthink them, what you could do with them, and so on. I think now there's also very political movements within this whole bottom-up movement, because it's not just about the technology, people are driven by the topics, you know? So I can see with my students, I have philosophy students that learn Python in 15 hours at home on a computer. Not because they want to learn Python, but because they want to do their project and make their critique.
Maybe you have to tell us what Python is. I'm not sure everybody knows.
Yeah, it's a program language. Sorry, geeky. But yeah, so learn to program certain languages in a very short time because they're driven by the topic. And I think, you know, some of the partners we're working with, you know, from like feminist hacking to the whole sort of African maker scenes. And, you know, there's so many bottom-up movements right now who are learning digital literacy because they want to do something or change something or make something, not just for the sake of the technology. So I think we definitely need both things. We need sort of, you know, the state to support, obviously, places like Calliope. We also need the bottom-up movements. We need it all at the same time. We need places like Garmin making those sort of decisions that you do. So the industry, you know, everyone. We need everyone.
But I think what you were talking about is also how do you get people interested in wanting to do those things, having those conversations. And I do think that exposure to it in some way, I mean, when you're going through school, when you're taking classes and trying to figure out what you're doing, you're kind of getting exposure to all of these different things. And that's really important because I love your example about the philosophy students getting into Python coding so that they can do some project and crunch on data or whatever. You know, there are a lot of applications that aren't just building some tech product. You can use these things, and there's a lot of underlying skills that can translate to lots of different areas. So exposing people to the different sides of all of this stuff, I think, is important for people to want to get involved in those bottom-up movements or get involved in the topics. And I think that's definitely important because otherwise, how are they going to hear about it? How are they going to get into it? I think we need that too.
And adding something from the moral perspective, which I really also liked about your talk, which I found really interesting, is understanding it as a negotiation. And I think you said that when you talked about your student projects, and I wondered whether there's a nice way to somehow train this negotiation, also including reasoning, negotiation, deliberating values. Because in the end, it's a social endeavor, obviously. And this always includes thinking about values. And this is also something that I think would be nice to include also in curricula, but also in other movements as a part of digital literacy, which is sometimes, like in the programs I'm aware of, sometimes it's part of it, but not always. And I think it's something that's really important because you might want to ask also pupils, like, what do we value about privacy? Why is it important to us? Like, why should we even care? And I think then negotiating it in a way by making things tangible and playing around with it could be a really nice approach. So I would also be for both directions.
What you have talked about just in the last 5 to 10 minutes, I think, are also different modes of production, right? That people work differently when you talk about negotiations, processes, when you start building into the product questions of privacy, which you talked about in your talk, Becky. So it seems to me that corporate actually has adapted, in some cases, pretty fast to new modes of production, right? What would you think? What's your assessment of that? That people are working much more collaboratively than maybe 20 or 30 years ago, even in big tech. I am told that those things actually are co-opted very fast. That it's probably hard to differentiate between what is bottom-up movement actually and what's happening at big tech. Do you know more about that? It's not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine question.
I think big tech always embraces these kinds of bottom-up movements because they know that that there's so much value in the talents and in these kinds of approaches because they bring innovation, and that's why Android is open source, but kind of open source, and you're always asking for whom is it really open. So is it really inclusive? Maybe not. And you can earn a lot of money with it. And that's not, so I'm not against earning money. That's really okay. But, if it's equally distributed and if it creates more, accessibility also to other players, this is very important, and not creating monopolies. So that's important. But also addressing these kinds of topics on a different level, as you say, so different modes and processes. And when you think about how in Germany we talk about these kinds of topics on a level of education, we talk about MINT, so STEM. And MINT is always so problematic. We have too few women in MINT, and we have this and that. And it's always so heavy, and everybody's sad and looking at the numbers and saying, oh, yeah, it's really problematic. And this, what you were showing, is not problematic. That's fun. We are hacking, and we're doing stuff that we love, and we do it with and through technology. And this is really a different approach. And when you address these topics in this way, in our lab, we have 70% of female working. And they are hackers. They are not like, doing other stuff, but they are into coding and into soldering and into everything. And you have to really embrace this as other mode of other topics and address it in a different way, and not staring at, we have a few software engineers sitting at the Technical University of Berlin in the Vorlesung. And
it's representation. You see a woman doing these things, and suddenly it's possible. And it's not enough to just look at statistics and say, oh man, this is a terrible problem. You have to actually come with a solution, or show where somebody has already found a solution, and celebrate that. I think that's almost more important than sitting there and looking at the numbers and being sad. I love the message, seeing those bottom-up movements and seeing there are organizations in the U.S. like Girls Who Code and things like that. It's fantastic what they're doing, and I think that's really shown people, oh, hey, this is something I could actually do it.
So we actually do see more diversity in tech, and the programs you've been talking about are largely state-funded programs, right? So the question would be, for now, is the state and its policies when it comes to funding of those more diverse programs in the MINT sector and in the tech sector actually more progressive than corporate, or is that like a European thing?
I think it's not well reflected yet on the German and federal level, because also what we see, the topics that are funded are usually the kind of the usual suspects. So it's more about security and tech, and it's about kind of the pure tech topics. It's not very much about other and alternative approaches. Also, for example, wearable computing is really not on the kind of highly funded.
I didn't get that.
Wearable computing is not on the top level of funding, or kind of creative reuses of tech is not kind of funded. So I think that this embracing this diversity, the companies are, I think, better. So not all of them, but being more inspired by these kind of different approaches, because they have the pressure that they need the talents. So as simple as that. It's not because they are so interested in everything, or not in first case, but really see that they need the talents and have to be attractive for the talents. I think that the federal government needs to be more open-minded there to other approaches to technology still. So they are a bit more kind of traditional, let's say. And that's why also here at Einstein Center Digital Futures, we have a hard time of really attracting also female talents. So we are doing kind of good. So we have 1/3 of the professors who are sponsored through this system are female, but they also come not from all the parts of the world. So there's a huge gap still in this kind of German-centric, European-centric, and not kind of really inviting also other topics of other parts of the world, also as Misha was showing. And this is desperately needed in order to understand also holistically and globally what inclusion means and how we come to maybe a shared vision of where we want to go to.
Yeah, I would agree. Also, just to support that again, because this, the problem sometimes with diversity and gender and this sort of inclusion debate is that if you have one representative, then everyone thinks it's getting better. So it's like an illusion. It's not really true. If you look at what's happening right now statistically, if you look at higher leading positions of women in tech, it's horrible. You would not believe we're in 2022. If you look at how many students, it's getting better, but students, who are studying like really the tech subjects, still not very diverse, and diverse also diversity, not just as in women and men, but really in diversity represented. I mean, to the things that get funded, like you said, it's harsh. The whole world right now is operating within a framework of thinking about technology, which is coming out of a very small place in California, to a very large extent. These are visions of what technology is, what friends are, how to categorize things, how you can treat data. And now, like Florian mentioned, we're trying to put plasters on that and fix that retroactively because we didn't create a European Google in the first place. And that's not even talking about the entire south of the world, which is being entirely put under this framework of a mentality, which was created in a very small place by a group of mostly well-educated white men from 25 to 30.
Mm.
So, I mean,
you're so fascinating. I love everything you're saying. I want to sit here and talk about this forever, but from someone who doesn't really know much about what the governments are actually funding and working on, I mean, I say that as someone who, I just don't hear about it, so other people probably don't either. I see corporations doing a lot more, and one of the reasons for that is one of the same reasons that I really hate using the law as a reason to do things, is because governments and the law move very, very slowly. Corporations and other entities like that are much more quick to adapt to things. They can do that. They don't have to move at that glacial pace, and that allows them to embrace things faster, which is nice. It would be nice if it could also work that way in the other. But, especially with security and privacy, sometimes by the time they finally crank out a law, things have moved on. It's a bit too late. And especially with security, that moves so fast. So I do think that corporations are probably doing a lot more and embracing a lot more just because they can move more quickly and kind of freely decide what they want to do. And it is a good selling point. I mean, there are always benefits in that regard.
Let me take this back to the notion of digital autonomy, which is actually part of the title of this event this afternoon. And I think one of the things I've learned is that it's very hard to find one-size-fits-all solutions to actually regulate just the notion what digital autonomy actually means in very different, very diverse cases. So that's a problem that has cropped up all the time, I think, in those last 4 hours, which makes it, of course, very difficult for the regulator, for the state to actually write something up that has to be somehow one size fits all, because that's what's democracy. It's one of the founding principles of democracy, that one size fits all at the end. But yet we know that's impossible to do when we talk about new technologies. And then, on the other hand, of course, just corporations, this would be, from the bird's eye view, excuse me for saying that, the American way of doing things, of letting the corporations find out what would be best for their consumers. You've talked about that, Becky, that you do that for your consumers. You're not into selling data to third parties and so forth, and your customers actually know this. So we're talking about a power struggle at the end of the day, right? Between what corporate is trying to do and what the state is doing. Now, of what I learned, I hear that the state has a big problem of actually providing those solutions because it just can't speak for everybody. It's just too complex. So if you want to summarize these lengthy questions, forgive me for this, can you actually tell us your view on what the GDPR in the last 4 years that it's been implemented now actually has brought, and what absolutely should be changed, and where do we need other players, other actors, other voices into the game to change it so it fits to more people than just one size?
I give it a start, but I start in the middle of your question, and then I hope the others can think while I'm talking and jump on it. I think it's really a question of who is in control for what. Like when we're talking about autonomy, it's all about self-control, social control, corporate control, political control, depending on which angle you want to take on the autonomy concept. And what I do think is, for the GDPR, at least from what I've seen in different contexts, and I've been involved in the process of well, seeing how it was put up, basically, I was always concerned about what Becky also said in her talk, like appropriate measures, adequate measures. And I always said, well, but who decides then what is appropriate? Like Garmin might have a very different idea of what's appropriate than what Michelle might have, and I have very ambitious ideas of what appropriate is. Like that's my role, obviously. So I think there's like ideally there would be some more specification of what appropriate is, especially for corporate context, because otherwise, like Garmin would be like not. I'm taking Garmin. Garmin is doing it fine, but like fine. Garmin could say, well, this is appropriate. Like we say it's appropriate, and like GDPR tells us we should have appropriate measures. Here's our appropriate measures, and I know that's also law speak, like juridical language, but it makes it hard to justify, and explain to people why this is appropriate and something else isn't. Yeah, and that also keeps this nice hole open for those companies that are not doing it great to say, well, like it's appropriate. This is not a big issue for the user, so we can do this as long as we can talk around how it's appropriate. And that's one mini bit around the wording that's everywhere on GDPR regarding appropriateness that I would like to see specified, but probably in practice that's not going to work because it's different for each and every context. Mm-hmm.
But, yes, I totally understand. But to make a statement here, I'm a big fan of regulation. So, and I would never, have thought about that I would become a big fan of regulation. But on the European level, in the last years, so there are not just GDPR, but the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the AI Act. So there's a lot of regulation now coming into place. And I think of course, there's so much to discuss about, and not one, the size might not fit to everybody. But we need a strong statement on the European level, and that's what we're doing. Because when I've been to China in my sabbatical in 2019, and I explored a bit the social scoring system, and I just don't want to have it here. And the AI Act tries to hinder it. And still we have to see whether the regulation is then appropriately put into place. And so let's see and let's observe whether we will stand together in Europe to really make it happen. But I think the vision that the European regulation tries to give a framework of how digital sovereignty, to put even another term into the debate, could be implemented in a free and democratic way. I think that's a big project, and let's keep the fingers crossed that it will, become reality.
Digital sovereignty is the topic of your event, actually, starting tomorrow over at Weizenbaum Institut at Alte Münze here in Berlin, right? The two-day conference called Digital Sovereignty. You've been writing a lot there, Michelle. I'm sure you have.
I don't know if
on my very lengthy question.
You want to go first? No?
I could literally talk about this for like 2 hours. I'm not going to. But that's why I was hesitating, because I was like, I don't want to talk first and then nobody else gets to say anything. But I have no problem with regulation. I think it's necessary. What I do find is, as I mentioned earlier, if you're working in a very reactive manner, you have a tendency to have tunnel vision. And a lot of what we're seeing in enforcement and things like that, and stuff that's coming from the regulators to help, very much has tunnel vision. They have some people in their sites that they're mad about. Everybody knows this. And so when they're doing these things, it's kind of to try to stop some of those practices, which realistically, I mean, you can regulate all day, whatever. And then the fallout from that is, well, we don't have a solution for it, so you just have to figure it out. And that's not helpful. And where I think it is it needs to be regulation, like we have, but then underneath that, there need to be, we've had these codes of conduct and certification portions of the GDPR forever. Where are they? Where are the experts in the industry groups who really understand, security and things like that? Why aren't they creating these? That's what we need. We need, okay, tell us how we can quantify what is adequate, what is appropriate in various situations. Corporations will have their policy documents that classifies data and figures that out, and they explain why they feel this or that is adequate. But you know, there again, at the end of the day, it's this accountability model. So if it ever comes to it, I have to argue with a regulator about why I'm right about that and defend it. And I can do that, but it certainly would be nice to have some guidance on that of, you know, what are you thinking? It's like this black box. We don't know exactly what, we're not sure what we wanted either. We'll just let you figure it out. We'll tell you if it's wrong, but we're not going to give you anything ahead of time to really help you. So like I said, it's kind of this very targeted tunnel vision stuff that's the shrapnel's hitting the rest of us, and kind of we want to do the right thing, but it really is a moving target, and it's difficult to do that. So I think the biggest problem is there were, well, first of all, several places where we don't have a lot of harmonization, and that's definitely an issue. But also they're like, yeah, we realize consent fatigue is a problem, but you have to have a lot of consents, separate consents, and this and that. So go figure something out. And that's really makes it difficult, because I mean, again, industry, that's what we do. We try to adapt and innovate, and you know, we'll do that. But it kind of stinks not to have any sort of, well, this is kind of what we were thinking along these lines. Now go work within some confines. I think that would be very beneficial to go along with the regulation, have some standards, have some codes of conduct, certifications that provide a baseline.
Michelle, to put it a little differently, do you think that European legislators are open to those bottom-up processes you've been describing in order to adapt, negotiate, to use a term you used a lot, to change GDPR or to evolve it?
Increasingly, I think politics is more open. We're all getting more transdisciplinary. But I have to play devil's advocate shortly on it, maybe just to also formulate the frustration side, because I mean, I like that something gets done, but sometimes I step back and I think, like, it's also so European, you know? It's like, we're so happy that we managed to regulate something, because we can sleep at night, and then, you know, everyone has to click on these ticks all the time, and it's completely distracting us from fundamental problems with the internet, because we can click our little Haken. Which are anyway manipulatively designed, so you have to make a massive effort to not click yes everything and only necessary. I mean, on top of it, and like, what is? I don't know. So I think it's a lot of
nuisance, yeah.
Yeah, but there's also not just a nuisance; it's a distraction as well. I think, like from the interface now, from this design of it. You know, one thing is to regulate, another thing is to make it a big part of everyday life and clicking on your mobile phone and your browser all the time. Yes, so that you feel like you're in control. But are you really? You know, and I think more actively people were also using before like ad blockers and browser plugins, and there was an explosion in that, and then suddenly it was like, yeah, now it's okay because I click OK. I don't know. So I think that there's this thing of being very like too late with things, too slow with things, trying to put plasters on things. Policy can never keep up. Radically has to change, right? The internet anyway, but policy too. So, and I think that actually exactly comes down to this transdisciplinarity, because it's something we know historically, you know, that the companies and the universities and politics, and that they don't speak enough with each other. The research is usually there, and they don't know what to do. I don't know. The companies have experiences and are trying things out. So are startups, so are maker spaces. Of course, you need to create these conversation spaces that it just goes much, much, much faster.
Yeah, we tried that, it didn't work. Or we tried that, it was great. That's good information to have. And you know, you have somebody making a law or whatever that doesn't really, has never worked in industry maybe, and doesn't really know the reality of whether you can actually take that thing and really do it. It can be pretty difficult. I disagree.
So I know it's popular to blame politicians, and that's always a good game, but you know, we're living in a democracy, and democratic processes are slow. They are slow in themselves, and European Union is a very complex system, and I fully understand. Of course, I wish that it could be much faster, but to understand that these kinds of understanding the complexity of the European Union, of policy making, and of the internet, and not just, you know, seeing, for example, face recognition technologies and then saying, oh, we just ban it. Or how do we treat it? So there needs to be these kinds of negotiations amongst politicians, citizens, many different actors to understand, you know, what's our also step-by-step approach, and leaving also a kind of open space where innovation can flourish. I think this is really a delicate process. And I understand everybody, you know, who says that's too slow, but I think we also have to be very aware that this democratic process is cumbersome. And of course, clicking on, you know, accept cookies is cumbersome. But I think that this is a step forward still in having autonomous decisions about how my data is used. And to see how China is treating these kinds of topics, they just do a dictatorship's, you know, decision and then saying we ban all motorcycles, and the next month they are gone. Okay, that's fast, but that's not democratic. So I think, you know, to be a bit more on the democratic side.
Well, and I'm not arguing against regulation. I think the regulation should still happen, but I think with things that move as fast as digitization and security, really what we need is a culture shift and these kind of standards that people have to adhere to, because, you know, again, something could happen if you don't have legislation for 4 years or whatever and things like that. It's a culture shift would take care of it, for thinking about it a different way and expecting them to behave in a certain way as a cultural norm. That's much faster. The regulation should still come, and I know it takes time, but solely relying on regulation, I don't think is ever going to be able to keep up and make meaningful change.
I'd like to be just super shortly in between the two sides, because I'm like my soul is torn. So I do think that we can very well use and benefit from regulations, also from Brussels. But at the same, because I agree, if we want tech made in Europe to be different to tech made in the far west or in the far east, then these are longer processes, and it needs like long time stakeholder engagement and so on, and that takes time. So I'm all for this, but I think the processes how we come there can be richer and can involve different methods. It doesn't always have to be people traveling to Brussels giving their input by speech, but it could there could be so many more interesting, more fun, more innovative methods to decide democratically how we want tech in Europe to develop. And I think that's missing sometimes. So I sometimes imagine it's different at more, I'm not a fan of Silicon Valley, but I imagine there's more space to just come up with new ideas, test it, play around with it, and then move on. And I think that bringing the methods and this different formats on how to come up with new ideas on how our future should look like, bringing this then to Brussels, for example, that would be a nicer way than it's currently done. So I think the goal is right, but how it's done is still slow and also not necessarily as creative and innovative as it needs to be if it's about new technology.
And their values are, which is very nice. I think even keeping up with discourses on open science, on transparency, and I think that's something which we have, even though it might be a slow process, that the value system is there, like you said, which is not only democratically decided, but also, very up to date from the discussions, and that's really important. I also wouldn't say it's just the fail fast and cheap. I don't really come out of startup culture. That's not what I'm looking for. What I was arguing before with the transdisciplinarity is more that that there's a fast way in general to have these discussions between, what we try to do also with research now is, of course, also, it's not that we do these projects anymore where we're in ivory towers for 5 years and at the end we publish a book that comes out 3 years later. We're, of course, trying to also create this debate now. And I think the places like the, Gesellschaft für Informatik Einstein Center and the Weizenbaum actually do that. And we're opposite politics, right? That's what's important. We need to have these spaces because then they also hear these perspectives that maybe they wouldn't necessarily come across otherwise.
I think maybe we're all saying that regulation alone is not enough.
Yeah.
We need these other things. We need these different ways to talk about things and explore the topics and make sure that we're really having a thorough view of things that are being regulated.
Well, that would be a whole different conference. I think the speed of government or policy making in Europe, I think there's slow government and then they're slower. And if you maybe compare what's happening in public transport in Europe, you see that governments do actually work at quite different speeds when it comes to the railway net or even autobahns and things like that. Well, anyway, I do have a plethora of more questions here, but it's been so interesting. But I think it's still your turn. We have about 15, 20 minutes to go. At most, I would like to ask you for comments or questions before I have one last question for everybody. There's 2 hands rising, Neil and somebody in the second row, so please.
Yeah, hi, Judith Michael, RWTH Aachen, software engineering. My question is also about the regulations. So I think one problem is that we are giving the regulations to tech companies, but we don't give them best practices on how they could do that in reality. I mean, it's somehow dangerous to give them benchmarks because then they are always optimizing towards these benchmarks. But I would say it lacked in the past that we haven't given them those because, yeah, they did the cookie banners because that was the most practical solution and the first one came up with that and then everybody else followed. Not because they found a very creative solution for that. So is there a possibility how we can create more creative solutions or different solutions for the regulations, or how can we give spaces to come to such solutions, also to provide tech companies alternatives to their common ways of doing that? So what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, there's one example I can immediately give from what has been tried out from the EU. There was the high-level expert group developing guidelines on AI ethics, and that was basically a nice or not so nice. People discuss about how good that is, but it was a document basically giving you guidelines, talking about trustworthy AI. Like I said, what I think about that. So you can discuss that, but they already in the process said, okay, what we actually need is then finding ways how to then use it and make it practical. And then the second step in this process really was developing best practices. And they went to, I don't know how many, 6 or 7 big companies that were also involved in writing this letter. And they tried out all kinds of different ways how to implement AI ethics in their company. And this process, as far as I'm informed, it's still ongoing. So they are still in the middle of trying out what works. But there will be a second, like a follow-up document that basically puts together their experiences with putting it into practice. So they at least tried with this little bit and topic, which is an important one, though. So that's what's running, and there are surely ideas of what could be done better.
Yeah, I also think that it's done. I don't know how how kind of completely, but maybe it's not so much also known in public. So I know, for examples, so I was part of the expert group at the Ministry of Justice back in the days when they were putting the legislation into place, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, so the kind of platform regulation against hate speech, and they were working before they were putting up the legal framework. They were working with the companies together. So they invited Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. I think these were the biggest ones, and they said, come out with, a self-regulation, and the framework was saying, if there's a hate speech kind of flagged by specific selected partners, so not everybody of us, but selected partners, then you have to take it down within 24 hours. And they said, well, of course we should do this. And then Twitter was kind of not reacting, just doing basically nothing, or just like weeks later or something. And then they were sitting together with the members of the ministry and with the members of the companies, and then saying, okay, now we put the legislation into practice, so we make up the law. And so this is so I understand that they are working also closely with the companies to come to a framework. And with this expert group, we also made some of these reports that nobody maybe reads, but they are there, working on digital sovereignty already in 2017. And we were, for example, suggesting that there should be more data trusts, so kind of intermediate infrastructures that handle my data, and maybe I can also sell my data if I want through these kind of networks, or just store them and give access to certain parties that I want to, but that I should not be obliged to individually click on all the stuff, but have somebody as a Treuhänder, so as a trustee handling my data. So there are these kinds of examples, projects, best practice examples in the kind of political systems, but maybe they are not that visible. So maybe it would be interesting to highlight them more, and maybe also to finger point also from public perspective, that this is needed and we should be more part of these kind of debates, because we just see, this is the law, why did they do this? And there's this shitstorm then coming up that, this is censorship, and that's totally okay. But maybe, being more transparent in the process before, maybe it would be also more, better to understand why it came to this point.
Okay. Neil, please, and then you want to give it to her? Okay.
Listening sort of this, it's interesting. We're talking about everybody needs to learn to code, but are we talking about the coders learning social science research methods, ethics to prevent bias in data, to be educating them about when you get a database, you have to be able to ask questions about, is this data representative, is there hidden biases in there? Which leads me to the question, I know that a few years ago there was this idea bandied about that software developers working on artificial intelligence, however you want to define that, decision-making algorithms, I think was another buzz phrase, they have to be certified in ethical coding or something like that. Is that something that you would pursue, that you think is a way of bringing people together? So not only asking non-techies to learn to code, but techies very much to understand about social science and bias. Thanks.
I think it would be definitely worth, and this is also happening every other place, to integrate this into the curriculum at the universities. So very much agreeing to your suggestion. This will just be one part of the solution. As we know, the bias might be in the data, and so to be aware of the blind spots in the data sets, this is very important. But also to teach this and to reflect on this should be part of the curriculum, and maybe also part of corporate digital governance of companies. Saying look at the data sets. But at the same time, we see that also the control of decision-making algorithms is really tricky. So it's, do you look, into the data sets? Do you control kind of the algorithm? Who should do this? Because, the output is then maybe unpredictable because the data set is unknown. And do you do ex ante or ex post control? So it's really tricky. So having many of these approaches, as you were saying, put into place and being more critically aware of what could happen, and not blaming, of course, the engineer because he or she does not have act in a bad manner and want to create false results. But this is a matter of fact. But being much more aware, I think that this is just starting also becoming part of the university approaches, and also of corporate governance to have statements there on ethical treat of data. So I think that we are a bit also late in these kinds of debate, but it's starting.
I'd like to feed in as well. So we're in Aachen, a big technical university with loads of engineering students. We also but we're actually also putting social science and humanities on their curricula, but of course, mini bits. But one thing that I like to do when I'm teaching computer science students is showing them how difficult it is to even say what fairness is. It's so easy to talk about fairness, and it's also not so difficult to show them how things go wrong if things are biased, but then being precise about what it actually would mean in such a situation to be fair is really difficult. And that's why I would say, the other way around, not every social scientist needs to learn to code, but they need to have a rough understanding of what's going on if someone codes and if someone develops also develops a product or whatever, having a rough understanding. And I wish from the other side that also the tech people have a rough understanding, because we want that's the discussion about transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity. We need expertise. We need people who really understand and can do their job, their discipline very, very well. But then we also need well, those same people and people in between who can do like the bridging jobs, like who are able to say, okay, like, dear computer scientists, this is not exactly fair, because fairness would require far more than just making men, women similar. Like that's sometimes still the understanding of what fairness is, like just gender equality. And they say, well, like, what else do we need to consider if we want to have a fair process, for example? So I think, like, as you say, it's super difficult, but we are at many technical universities, at least, where it's a good place to start, for sure. People put it into the curricula to teach students at least to consider those questions early on, which does not mean they turn into half-baked social scientists, of course.
Yeah, maybe also just to support. Thank you for raising that question, because I think that's getting less attention right now, and it, I would say, is equally vital. Absolutely. And I think we are, I mean, the TU Berlin also has the Berlin Ethics Certificate, and it hasn't always been standardized as part of a curriculum everywhere, but it's being very encouraged. And half of our classroom is that way, it's programmers who come because they want to also learn, because they hear these discussions, because it's in the news, and they're interested in actually finding out, how can I learn what this is and sort of take position on it, and how could I work, at least have a place to discuss it. So, yeah.
Let me just do a really quick round to finish this up, so we are not running late. Again, I'd like to start with Becky Caldwell. When we talk about, you know, when I manage my cookies, we talked about it as a after the GDPR was implemented. I'm halfway okay with that. My parents definitely aren't, that are 80 and are very active online. Both of them are. I'm sure you probably, most of you make the same experiences with your parents, be they younger or older, I don't know. But that's the case at my home back in Switzerland, at least. Now, what I'm sometimes missing from that decision is a button that says, I don't know. I mean, all those questions are just very binary as yes or no. They don't work with uncertainty. We've touched on that before when we talked about applied ethics with Saskia, Nagel, right? And half of the time, if I'm honest, I would like to choose, I don't know. I have no clue what I should do. And if I press that, nothing happens. I mean, wouldn't that be actually an interface that would be quite helpful for, I would suspect, the majority of people?
Well, and I mean, so first of all, cookies, the regulation around cookies has been around a lot longer than GDPR. It just made it a lot more visible. Yeah. And so, you know, these have been kind of things that people should have really been developing better solutions to the problem in the past. But we're also required to, for example, I have to give you a yes and a no. I don't have a choice. That's what the regulation and all the guidance says. I have to do that. You know, Google and I think Facebook both got fined recently because they didn't have a no button. They only had an agree and then learn more. And so I mean, it took you to information and things like that, right? But they were saying they don't want that. They want people to be able to just click yes or no on the top level. And also, it comes down to the challenge of that whole 25 days a year on privacy policies. It's how do you give this information in a meaningful way to allow someone to make a decision quickly? Are they even going to read it? That's what can I put there that they'll read and maybe internalize so they can make that informed decision? And that's a really difficult thing to try to do. I don't have the perfect solution, by the way. I wish I did. But it is made difficult by some of these specific requirements that have come out to try to corral the companies that are not actually doing what they're supposed to do. And, oh, you have to have this, you have to have that. You have to ask for consent for all of these different things to place, whatever. And so it does make it difficult to make it a more user-centric experience in that regard. So you do try to provide more information, but it's a very technical topic. How do you provide that in a way that's accessible, like you said, for maybe your parents or somebody's kid who's just on a website, right?
Okay,
it's
for
very
me,
difficult.
not my parents. I'll leave out my parents out of the equation. Let's be honest. Michelle, it's a kind of devil's advocate argument too. I've been making once in a while here the last 3 or 4 hours that I always keep saying we're asking a lot of the user, right? And we're talking about digital autonomy. It's just a lot to digest and to learn and to know and to manage all the time. And one of the things that's been studied in some of the IniviDas projects are visualizations, pictures, things like that. You have any experience with that you think we should be all become more visual on the internet and not so text-based, maybe? Is that something you've encountered in your studies?
Yeah, I think visual. I think, yes, good visuals. I think experienceability, like being able to touch stuff and experience things. Actually, that's where we work a lot with exhibitions as communication.
Yeah.
I think it's a very different way of learning as well. I think that helps. Still, there's so many fundamental things, right? You said user turned citizen before, and then I was like, I don't like citizen because of like I'm not a citizen here, right? I have no right.
Me neither.
Right? So, you know, it's like people, you know. So it starts with there, as well as I want to deconstruct. Also on the screen in front of me, the digital autonomy. I'm not so sure if this putting digital in front of everything.
Citizen would highlight the active part of the person interacting with the technology, while user is more the passive part. I would say that's the thing I wanted to highlight.
I get it. I'm just saying that all of these terms right now in themselves, you know, like citizen already refers to someone who has certain rights, and we have a lot of stateless students who don't have that. Digital autonomy. I like the Weizenbaum always talks about social self-sovereignty. And doesn't talk about digital autonomy, because you know you can't split digital from real life empirical experiences and so on.
Just
you
go
know,
with autonomy. That's also fine.
Yeah,
like, that gives you what you need. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, I think there are definitely different ways of communicating than having to read a lot of text. But I think even if we would have like crazy image shows, we still couldn't look at all of that. It would take maybe 12 days.
Yeah. And how do you make sure that every societal norm, you know, that means the same thing to me as it would at somebody who grew up in wherever?
I don't think it's that we have the responsibility to read it. I think it's that we have the option. I like that we have imprints in Germany. I don't read everyone's imprints, but I read a lot of them. Who are you actually funded by? Where are you based? Who is this? You know, I can if I want to. So I think it's more that, having the option.
Is the human brain fast enough to adapt to all those challenges? Saskia, Nagel, you talked about that we have a hard time of letting go of actually quite of an old concept of autonomy that we have and of trust. And that's probably what we'll have to do or have to learn pretty fast when we talk about AI. How to come out of that?
You're talking to my former persona as a neuroscientist, where I would say it takes quite a while, but we are adaptable and we can change, and we do change all the time. The question just is, and that's putting my hat on as an ethicist again, like in which direction do we want to change? And I think that's like, to me, it like the discourse often sounds as if we somehow have to handle what's happening to us, but we are the ones who are developing what is happening to us. So I forgot the exact slogan, but it was in the beginning of your talk. Like we design and are designed. Like what was it?
What we design designs us back.
Yeah, exactly. So so sorry for forgetting that, even though I was so excited about it, because that's exactly like that. Like it's not our like we can do something, and it's our task to think about where we want to go. And like these kinds of discussions help us to negotiate what is the future we want to experience. We want our future generations to experience, and that maybe our brains or your parents' brains or our children's brains are not able to process what they are confronted with at the moment, means that we have to adapt it for them now to make it make them able to process it. But for the future, it also means that we need to think about how do we want to be? Like, do we want to be more and more like cyborgs? Maybe we do. I'm looking over there, because there is no one size fits all, of course. But in a democratic society, we need to find ways to agree on directions. And there, I'm jumping on your first question again, because I think I would love to see more shades of how much I agree to something. Like I don't want to give yes or no all the time. Like I would also love to say, okay, yeah, maybe 20%, and the rest I'm not so sure about. But these are all things that we need to decide on. And if we decide at the moment yes or no, it's our choice that we go for yes or no. We could also go for, we can go for Likert scale or for colors or for something different. But at the moment, that seems to be the design that people agreed on is good. And then we go with it. But we can change it. And I think I can't stress that often enough. We shouldn't complain and say how terrible it is that we need to deal with the situation. Let's change it if we don't agree that this is good for us. It's a bit of a pathetic call, but that's what we should all use our roles to change when we think something is not developing as we think. And everyone has their small areas where they can do something, like everyone at home as well. And then do something. If you don't agree, then don't agree. And if you have an idea, go to a place where you can play around with your ideas and put it out there. So, enough.
A call to change, a call to become a scientist or an entrepreneur. That's two of the things we've been discussing this afternoon. So as a very last question, of course, we talked about digital literacy just about an hour ago. And of course, the big topic behind this is digital alphabetization and the comparison to the printing press, of course, that came over Europe as a storm more than 600 years ago and led to the Reformation and all the other things that happened after that. Do you think, Gesche, Joost, that we're at the beginning actually of a similar process and that the questions we've been discussing today will seem futile? Of course, the processes are much faster than they've been 600 years ago, but that they will seem futile 20 years from now?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's also why I'm late. I just came from a digital debate with the Protestant church members. So they had a conference on AI. And that's a big sign. They, from the different education systems and institutions within the church, were asking themselves how to deal with AI. And that's a really great sign. And they are talking also about, what kind of values and perspectives they could bring to the table, because I think we need this diversity of really different people, of families, of tech activists, of artists, of every also religion and cultural background. And they were after my presentation, they said we would need not to have another Börse vor 8, but we should have these kinds of debates before the Tagesschau. And this was a sign saying, this is what digital literacy would be about. So, from school level on up to, really for elderly, having some kind of literacy training and having different access points. So not all the full-blown AI debate about algorithms, but very, hands-on, how do I do mobile banking in a secure way, or how do I treat what do I do with my photos to share them with the family? Is it safe, to use WhatsApp? Sure. So these kind of very pragmatic approaches. And so this is great, so that we see this here, and also that in different federal states of Germany, now we have Informatikpflichtfach, so that it's integrated into the curriculum, finally. When we started Calliope in 2016, there were full pages articles in the FAZ and other print media saying this is still something that the devil has brought to us, digitization, and the kids should go play outside and
the FAZ of all papers,
and climb on trees. And I was like, are you kidding me? And so this
they should also do that,
of course,
right?
And they could take whatever physical computer with them if they like to measure the moisture in the ground or something. So it could be a fun approach. But we have this opposition not any longer, so it's getting better. So this is a good sign. And I also want to jump on your first question. That's a really good one. There should be a third button, but saying this is a famous figure from literature. It's called Bartleby, and he says, "I prefer not to." And I love this. I prefer not to is not a no, but maybe I prefer not to. So I prefer not to share my data. And this is a beautiful figure I would love to see in these buttons reflected.
Bartleby is definitely a good token because he doesn't like to work, and we're at the end of our working day right now. We prefer not to continue talking right now, and we're waiting for Einstein vor 8 in the German public television 10 years from now. Let's see what happens then. See you next year or before that. Vielen Dank, Elisabeth Schauermann, co-curator of this event here for Digital Autonomy and Smart Wearables at Einstein Center Digital Futures. Thank you for being with us here on site. Thank you for watching at home. Thank you, Becky Caldwell, Michelle Christensen, Saskia K. Nagel, Gesche, Joost, and Herr Conradi here. Thank you for being with us. Have a good evening. Tschüss.
Das ist halt aber auch einfach doof, das immer so gegen